This episode of Analog Resurgence brought to you by Skillshare. Stick around after the video to learn more.
Oh hi, I didn't see you there. I was busy developing my own black and white negative film at home. Something that's actually very easy to do if you have even a little bit of knowledge. You see, not all sorts of film developing has to be done by fancy labs with nice machines and lots of chemicals. In fact, there are tons of products and resources that allow you to develop your own film at home. Yes, even the most amateur film photographer can become a pro developer at home with even just a little bit of knowledge and understanding of the basics. And today, for black and white negative, that's what I'm going to be teaching you guys.
Today, I want to do a primer for black and white film developing. I'm going to be walking through the basics and giving some explanations about the process and talking about what's involved and what you might need to be able to do it yourself, so that in the future I can refer back to this video so that I don't have to entirely repeat myself every time I do more developing videos. Black and white negative film developing is the easiest process to do yourself at home. It requires less chemicals and even somewhat less precision in comparison to doing color negative yourself. Developing is the process of taking the exposed roll of film that you have shot through your camera, putting it through a wet chemical process so that you get your final roll of images back. Your film usually has negative versions of your images on it, and these are intended to be either scanned or printed afterwards so that you can have your final shot. There does also exist reversal film, which is a film and chemical process that is separate from negative developing that gives you back a positive image on your film. But today, we are just talking about black and white negative film and developing. My desire for this video is that it will both be long but also detailed enough so that you have a variety of understanding and context so that you can go into this whole developing thing with some understanding of what's actually going on. So let's get started by talking about how film works. Now, I'm not a science person, but really basically this is what's going on. Film is made up of multiple super thin layers that are coated onto a base material. There are protective layers and anti-halation layers to reduce unwanted reflection, and then there's the emulsion. The emulsion is where the magic happens. Emulsion contains silver halide crystals that are suspended in a gelatin layer, and this is the layer that holds your image when you expose. When you take a picture and expose the film, the crystals store the light that enters the camera. The silver halide crystals are light sensitive, so they retain light that hits them. Film is light sensitive. All film is light sensitive. Not just 35, but medium format, 4x5 sheet film, Super 8, 16, all this stuff. Light sensitive. If you take film out of the canister or the camera or the container or whatever in broad daylight, then you will be ruining your film and you will not be able to develop it once you have taken pictures with it. Most of the film developing process needs to take place in complete darkness. If you don't have a proper darkroom or the ability to set up your own darkroom at home though, don't worry, because that doesn't necessarily mean you can't develop film at home. Film developing is the process of converting those light-sensitive silver crystals into a proper image and removing their light-sensitive characteristics in the process. Super duper. Everyone should definitely do their own research in order to supplement the information in this video and just not rely on YouTube primarily anyways, but I have to assume most people won't. Black and white negative developing involves these three main steps that have to be followed in this exact order. Number 1, developing. Number 2, stop. Number 3, fixing. And our bonus step.
Party on, dudes!
The developing stage of the process involves a developing chemical of your choice, and there are a ton of choices out there. Developers offer a variety of characteristics that impact your images in different ways. Fine-grained developers, developers for different sharpness, higher contrast, more detail in the shadows or the highlights. A lot of different developers out there, but also a lot of information for different developers as well. So you're not going to be in the dark when you're trying to research developers. A developing chemical reduces the size of the silver crystals that have been hit with light on your film. After that, we use a stop bath. Stop bath chemicals, or alternatively a water rinse after the developer, halts this developing process and prevents your film from developing further than it needs to. And finally, our fixer chemical, which removes any remaining unneeded, unexposed silver on the film. After your film is in the fixing process, then the light sensitivity of it is lost. And only after that can you take a look at this film in the light without destroying it. A final important step that a lot of people recommend is a rinsing process using a chemical like Kodak's Photo Flow or Ilford's wetting agent. These are chemicals that help your film to dry without water spots on them, and they're very useful, and I definitely recommend them. Alright, now that I have bestowed upon you a very basic understanding of how black and white film works and the black and white developing process, which is important because, of course,
knowledge is power!
Now let's talk about what's involved in developing your own rolls of black and white film at home yourself. Most of this process requires the film to be in complete darkness because film is light sensitive. There is a common misconception about the use of red lights in dark rooms, and the idea that using a red light in a dark room allows you to handle the film and be able to see what you're doing. This is wrong. Don't do that. A red safe light is often used during the darkroom printing process for black and white because black and white photo paper lacks sensitivity to red light. But when we're handling photographic film, motion picture film, color film, most black and white film, you cannot use a red light to look at it. It will ruin the film, it will expose it, and it is not a way of being able to see what you're doing in a darkroom. This is because all those films still have red light sensitivity, even though they're black and white. Acros, Tri-X, HP5, most black and white films have some level of red sensitivity. A red light can only be used when you're handling film if you're using true orthochromatic film. Orthochromatic film lacks red sensitivity entirely, so that's the only time that you can use it, but most films are not orthochromatic. Now, I'm probably going to make a video about the whole red light thing anyways, just as a small little reference for people, because a lot of people ask about it, and that scene in Stranger Things really messed people up a few years back. What? For developing film at home, we use this. This is a film developing tank, and it is designed in such a way that you can pour chemicals in and out of it with the lights on and not ruin the film that is inside. But for loading the film into it, that still needs to be done in complete darkness. Some people have the ability to create their own darkroom or like a makeshift darkroom or dark space in their own home, which is great. I'm super happy for you, but not everyone has the ability to do that. For myself at home, whenever I'm loading film into these tanks, I use a dark bag. Dark bags have zippers and armholes in order to create a light-tight bag for handling undeveloped film. You can get them in various sizes, and they're great for if you can't create your own darkroom. You put everything you need inside of them, and then you can safely handle the film in a light-proof environment. Film developing tanks offer a light-proof way of developing film at home. Again, they first require you to load your film onto a reel in the dark, and then everything else can be done in the light, which is great. These black and red Patterson developing tanks are by far like the most popular, recognizable, and well-known brand when it comes to this, and they use these plastic film reels that go inside of them. Let's talk about 35mm primarily here. For 35mm in complete darkness, you have to remove the film from the canister and load it onto this reel. Now, it sounds tough, and honestly, it's probably gonna go a little sideways the first dozen times you try it, maybe. But for most people, in time, with some practice, it does get a lot easier. Okay, for this demo of loading, I'll be doing it blindfolded as an example of how this works. And then I'll be also just using a sample roll of old film that I don't mind ruining by loading it in the light and showing off. So everybody get ready, and we'll do a demo about how to load the film. Okay, so to get started, I've got my Patterson tank, I've got a can opener, and I've got a pair of scissors. And I also have my roll of film. Again, this is film that will be ruined because I'm showing it off in the daylight, but it is film that I do not care about. So let's open up our Patterson tank. That's the lid. This is the funnel piece that goes on and it rotates and clicks into place to make everything light proof. And inside we've got our reel that is on a spindle here. So the stem that it slides onto and sits in there. So that's also very important to make sure that you have. So we've got our reel and we've got edges here that open up so that we can feed our film into it. So first we're going to pop open our canister of film, and I just use a can opener to do this. You can alternatively also just rip it open if you want to, but I like to do this. It's nice and clean. We want to slide the film out, and we want to make sure that it doesn't unspool in our hands as we're doing this. So I find it really easy to load onto these reels if we actually make a little crease here, then take our scissors and then try and cut kind of a straight edge. It's just easier to load using a straight edge as opposed to using the tail of the film that we use when we're threading it and loading it into our camera. So now that we've got this, we can just want to align the opening of our reels so that they are together across from each other, and then we want to thread this film in. We want to just pull it past the ball bearings. The ball bearings on these reels help to advance the film as we're twisting it. It kind of grabs it and pulls it. So now we're ready to go, and I can kind of like hold the film up here, but if it starts to kind of unspool and fall down here, that's okay as long as I'm aware of where it is and it's not getting like tangled and creased and damaged. So now we just want to start to advance the film onto the reel. And hopefully it should go really smoothly. Sometimes it might stop and start a little bit, and usually you want to be just a little bit slower than this and work it on really carefully. Now that we've hit the end of our roll, we can feel that it is either held on inside the spool of the canister of film, or it's actually like taped on using an adhesive. So we want to just cut this just a little past the point where it's attached. Get rid of that garbage, and then you want to continue rolling it on. And it should just kind of like feel nice and smooth, which means that everything's on. So now we want to put our spindle back on, which is somewhere. Now, here. Put the spindle back through, put it into the tank so it's fitting nice and smooth, and you can kind of spin it around and it's sitting right in the middle. And then put the funnel back on, rotate, click it into place so it's nice and secure and it won't fall out, which means that now it is light proof, and I can take this off. Put the lid back on, and we're ready to go. You can now open it, access it in the light. You can pour chemicals in, you can pour chemicals out, and it is safe. It might seem a little difficult, but I do really recommend picking up maybe just super cheap rolls or anything that you can find that you don't mind sacrificing, and practice. Because the more you practice with this stuff, the easier it does get. Patterson tanks aren't your only option for developing at home, though. There also exists the metal tank. The metal tank takes film on these metal reels inside of them, and they are different from the plastic ones. To load these metal reels, we poke these spikes through our sprocket holes and then slowly roll the film onto it by curling it slightly. And then we just rotate the reel and everything just smoothly goes onto it in the first try, definitely. There's a lot of fear around the metal ones, but some people definitely swear by them and feel that the metal reels allow for more even developing, but they can definitely be much harder to load. For myself, I actually learned on the metal reels, which was pretty uncommon for most people, and later I switched to the plastic ones. I prefer the plastic ones, and I do find that they're easier and quicker to use, but oh boy, is there something so satisfying about successfully loading a roll of film onto these metal ones. It feels so good. So that being said, I definitely do recommend the Patterson ones, and you can get like film developing kits and things with like multiple stuff. You can get such a variety of these tanks and accessories that go with them, so they're usually a pretty good choice. And also, where the metal ones need different reels in order to do 35 in medium format, these ones just snap apart and can become medium format reels as well. If you're really struggling with these Patterson film reels, then there are some alternatives. There's ones like these that are slightly different that I've seen people mention online as being somewhat easier, but I have no real experience with these ones. So we've got film in the tank, which means that we are ready to talk about chemicals. The two chemicals that you absolutely need for this process are a developing chemical and a fixing chemical. The middle step, which is the stop bath, can actually be substituted for a water rinse instead. It can be less precise and take just like a little bit longer than using a stop bath chemical, but you can use water if you don't want to buy stop bath. I use water all the time for a stop bath instead of buying a stop bath chemical. I do multiple water rinses over the course of a minute or so, and I've never had any issues. You've got your choice when it comes to film developer, and I do not have experience with all of them, so it is absolutely best to do your own research and explore and experiment when it comes to deciding what film developers that you like personally. And of course, people down below in the comments sound off on your preferred developing, and keep things civil because everybody likes to do things different ways. You can get liquid chemicals and you can get powder chemicals, but usually whatever you get involves mixing them properly by adding water and appropriately diluting them so that they become usable. A bottle of chemical is our stock solution. It's what we buy from the store, and it requires mixing a proper dilution to use with our film. Most chemical bottles have information on them for the ratio of water to chemical that you need in order to mix your working solution. So don't just go buying like jugs of chemicals and start pouring them right into developing tanks without really knowing what's going on and exactly how to dilute and everything, because these are not like ready to just go most of the time. For a lot of my own stuff, I've fallen into the habit of using Kodak HC110. It's pretty popular to do that for some reason. I'm also a little lazy sometimes, but I don't often develop a ton of rolls myself. HC110 can last a long time. I can mix a very small amount just based on like doing a handful of rolls at once, and then I can dispose of it. I would never say that HC110 is like the best developer in the world, because it's very likely not. It is not the best for like grain or sharpness and that kind of thing, but it can be okay to learn with. Gotta cover all my bases. Somebody's gonna yell at me about something. For HC110, I use dilution B, which is 1 part chemical to 31 parts water. One roll of 35 millimeter requires only about 300 milliliters to develop. So let's do our math. 1 to 31 is 32 parts in total. So 300 divided by 32 is about 9 milliliters. So we need 9 milliliters of our developer. And 300 minus 9 is 291 milliliters of water. So you're also going to want some measuring beakers and containers to help do this precisely. So first I'm going to take about 9 milliliters of my HC110 developer solution, which is a very small amount of developing chemical. And then in my larger beaker, I need to get everything to the 300 milliliter line. So I'll just get the water to the correct temperature, throw some in the beaker, add my developer, and then just top it up with more water until I hit the 300 milliliter line. And that gives me the correctly diluted amount of developer for my film. Now with the water and the chemicals together, I just need to mix it up. So I honestly just like to throw it into a jug and then shake the jug. But you alternatively can also buy a stir stick if you want to. So with HC110, I just kind of mix things as I need it. But with a lot of other film developing chemicals, things like Kodak's T-Max developer and Ilford's ID11 and just a ton of things that are out there, you can mix large quantities at once, and they're good for a certain amount of rolls, which again are either detailed on the packaging, the bottles of the chemical itself, or with a simple Google search to find like the data sheets and the information that goes along with the chemicals that you're buying. Always do your research and like the bare minimum amount of reading for this stuff as you're buying it. If you're mixing a bunch of developer at once, then it has a shelf life. It's only good for so long, and there's different ways of storing chemicals over periods of time, but it's important to be sure that you're tracking how many rolls you're developing with the chemicals that you have mixed. Our fixed chemical works about the same way in terms of mixing it. It requires dilution from the stock solution. Fixed, however, is always meant to be used for many rolls before it's exhausted, so we do store this once we mix it. An incredibly important part about this whole process are the times and the temperatures that we're using when we're developing our film. When we're developing color negative film, you need to be really precise with your color developing chemicals so that you can avoid color shifts and just poor results. But black and white can be just a little more lenient with slight shifts in the temperature of your chemicals during the developing process, which is why it is so much easier to start with and learn and do at home. For black and white, we want our developing chemical to be 20 degrees Celsius / 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius is usually about like room temperatures, which means that it's not too hard to get your chemicals to the right temperature if you're developing stuff at home. Unless you live in an old, poorly insulated apartment that gets super hot in the summer and super cold in the winter. It makes everything really hard to do if you're working with chemicals. In which case it requires maybe filling up a sink and letting your chemical get to the right temperature. I recommend using some thermometers for tracking your temperature because it's important for the developing process for the chemical to be right. Chemicals that are too cold won't be as active for the developing, but chemicals that are too hot can be too active. Most developing times for films that are given on film data sheets and chemical bottles are using 68 degrees Fahrenheit / 20 degrees Celsius as their standard temperature. Color developing is done at a much warmer temperature. You can also do some math and adjust your black and white developing time for a different temperature if you're having temperature troubles. When we develop our black and white film, we are developing it based around the ISO that we shot our film at. And a lot of time we are developing it based on the box speed of the film. The box speed is just the film ISO that is printed on the box. So we developed Tri-X 400 as a 400 ISO film. We developed Acros as a 100 ISO film. I keep saying this, but again, so many films have data sheets available online that will give you basic developing times and also characteristics and information for the films and what works best. Some of these films also have their information on the developing bottle as well. And beyond data sheets and information on the side of bottles, a lot of films also have developing info inside of the actual film box that they come with as well. So just fold these out and there's some basic times and information for certain chemicals. The other big online resource that a ton of people use is called the Massive Dev Chart. It's a website that has a bunch of different information around like your developing time and temperatures and what film you're using, what developer you're using. There's a ton of information on that website. It also has an app and you can use it easily on your phone, which is appealing to most people. But it's also really important to note that it's kind of like community built. So it's based around people submitting information. And there can be like inaccuracies and times that don't work for everybody and information that isn't appropriate for you to use based on like your environment and like, you know, exactly what you're doing. I'm not saying that the Massive Dev Chart is entirely inaccurate because there's some great information there, but use it as not a hard rule all of the time. Again, developing involves a lot of experimenting and learning on your own, and also just doing research about what you're shooting and what you want your results to look like, and learning, remember,
knowledge is power.
I do recommend checking out the Massive Dev Chart, but I don't recommend just blindly following it all the time. So again, we've got our film in the tanks and we know our steps, which are number 1, developing, number 2, stop, number 3, fixing, and of course, our bonus step.
Party on, dudes!
So without further ado, it's go time.
So I'm going to do a quick run through of developing some Ilford Delta 400 in Kodak HC110, just so we can see the process. Again, I've loaded up my Delta 400 roll into this tank, which means that it is ready to be processed safely. And based off of the data sheet for this film, we need to develop it for 7.5 minutes in HC110 dilution B, and again at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. I've also got a jug of water here, which I will be using for my stop bath instead of a stop bath chemical, and my jug of fix that has been mixed previously and is all in this one jug. So this one will be reused. At the end, I will pour the fix from my tank back into this jug just using a funnel. With our film developer at temperature, it's time to open the lid of our tank and pour in our chemical. As we do this, we start our timer going for the correct amount of developing time. I've got one of these big chunky darkroom timers, but like a timer on your phone is perfectly fine as well. So I set it to 7.5 minutes. During the developing process, we do what are called agitations. And agitations are the gentle, repeating motion of rotating the tank. And this allows for the chemicals in the tank to thoroughly move across the film and keeps everything fresh. After we're done agitating, we set the tank down firmly on the counter so that it will loosen any air bubbles that might have been attached to the film that occurred while we were doing agitations. Any trapped air on your film leads to uneven development. There are sometimes suggestions for how frequently to agitate based on what you're developing, but I usually do something like 15 seconds of agitation every minute. During the developing, agitating more or less can impact the outcome of your developed film. This process might also sometimes be called inversions, but it's ultimately just meaning that you're rotating and moving the tank to keep the chemicals flowing. Patterson tanks also allow you to use a little handle and rotate the reel inside of the tank if you want to do that as well, but I usually just do a full tank movement. At the end of our development time, we pour our chemical out of the tank and begin our stop process. You have to be quick about this because there's still developer residue on the film that needs to be neutralized. I use water instead of a stop bath chemical and I've never had any problems with it. I just do a rinse with some water a few times over about 1.5 minutes.
The water I use is still about the same temperature of the developer because you don't really want to put in something that is drastically different and have a big temperature shift because that can impact the film as well.
For the stop process, I do much more rigorous agitations to make sure that the water is helping to really remove any sort of developer that's still sitting on the film. And it is less of a concern than if I was agitating like this while I was actually developing.
Now it's time for our fix it. The fixed temperature doesn't have to be precise like a developer temperature, but again, it shouldn't be too hot or too cold. Fix time is given on the side of our fix bottle and is typically around 5 to 15 minutes. It won't damage your film to leave your film in the fix a little bit longer, and as your fix ages over the course of multiple rolls, it tends to become less effective, which means that your fixing times might increase. My fix is running a little cool, and I've been using it for quite a while now, so I'm going to set it for about 15 minutes. Once we're done fixing our film, we pour the fix back into the jug because I'm going to continue to use this in the future. And then we need to put our film under some running water for about 10 minutes. And this is just to rinse off as much fix residue that's still on the film as we can. Keep an eye on this, and I like to kind of keep it moving and rinse it thoroughly so that the water is not just sitting in the tank. And my final step, as I mentioned before, is to use PhotoFlow or some sort of similar final rinsing chemical. It's just a soapy solution that helps your film to dry without water spots or streaks or any sorts of marks on it. And you only need to use a little bit of PhotoFlow for rinsing film. I'm usually not super precise with this, and I just throw a little bit in a cap and throw it in and rinse the film. I'm just going to do it in the tank here, but I do also recommend that maybe you just get either a container or fill up the sink with water and some PhotoFlow, take the film off the reel, and just put it in the PhotoFlow solution that way.
For drying my film, I will just hang it up on a clothes hanger in the shower, and I just use some little clips. So it doesn't have to be a really expensive process for everything. You don't need specialty items for every step of the process if you're only kind of just doing this casually. This might be the hardest part of the process to show, but it's sitting in the PhotoFlow and I'm ready to take it out of the tank. So it's still on the reel. I can actually either unroll it slowly and gently from the reel, or I can actually like separate the reel and then just grab it kind of all at once, which I prefer to do if I can. We can see there are images, and we'll take a closer look at a better time. Developed.
Once my roll of film is dry, then I cut it into strips and I store my negatives safely in archival sleeves like these. These are 35mm sleeves from Printfile, and Printfile is one of the bigger names for this stuff. You can get 35mm sleeves, medium format, 4x5, and even sleeves for mounted slides.
And that is black and white film developing. After you've done this process to a roll, it cannot be repeated, it cannot be undone, and you can't redevelop a roll again to fix mistakes or to do it differently. It's not how it works. What's done is done. You'll kind of know right away once you take that film out of the tank and you hold your breath if anything has gone drastically wrong. And of course in the future I can go more into detail about common issues with developing and just like weird problems you might encounter and just like troubleshooting some stuff. But if everything is done properly, then you should have some solid looking negatives after you remove that film from the developing tank. This is a cool process, don't get me wrong. It is essentially creating your image. And there's just so much that goes along with it, and a lot to know and a lot to learn, and it's really fun once you like get into the swing of things. But one point that I really want to make clear for people who are getting into this, who are developing film for the first time, who are getting into just film in general in any way for the first time, good developing does not make up for bad exposures. Knowing the basics of exposing your image and like taking a good picture and having all your settings right helps to get a good final result. There's only so much in a developing process that can be done to fix a poorly exposed image. You need to have your settings right on your camera when you take your picture in the first place. Issues in developing, like overdeveloping and underdeveloping, can also greatly impact your image as well, so it is important to have a
level of precision when you're doing all of this stuff, but exposing your image is number one. After we've finished developing our black and white negative film, we end up with a negative. During the process, the tones of the image are flipped so that we have an inverted version of our picture on the film. So once you have a negative, you are ready to either print or scan from the film so that you can have your final positive image. As you're developing, you will hopefully slowly learn how to read a negative. You have to think about the opposite of the image when you're seeing the film because it's a negative. A negative that is very thin will be a very dark, underexposed, or underdeveloped image when it's inverted. A very dense negative is an image that is too bright and blown out, possibly overexposed or overdeveloped. This video is definitely not going to delve deeply into the scanning side of your film after you've developed, but it is necessary in order to get digital copies of the images on your developed film. I scan my film at home using an Epson V700 flatbed scanner, and you can get flatbed scanners like these that have a top area that allows for illumination of transparent film and film holders to properly hold your film on the flatbed. I use a program called Microsoft Silverfast. There's also things like ViewScan and Epson Scan that other people use as well. And for use in videos and for just uploading and sharing around, a flatbed gives me perfectly fine images at home. Flatbeds aren't necessarily the best for scanning 35 because it is a smaller film in comparison to medium format. But again, for my own personal uses, I get by perfectly fine with a flatbed. There's also a very large growing community based around what's called DSLR scanning, which is using a higher end digital camera and a macro lens and proper film holders to capture digital copies of the frames off of your negative. And then you do editing in Lightroom or Photoshop or a program like that. I also recently looked at some film scanning apps for your phone, and those are all terrible, so don't do that. And you can also take your film into a lab or someplace that has a scanner or offers scanning services and have your film scanned by a higher end scanning machine. Now, I did not cover push processing and pull processing in this video because it is a whole other topic that deserves an individual focus. Push processing means to increase your developing time so that you can push for greater detail in certain areas of your image. And pull processing is the opposite. It's when you decrease your developing time so that you can pull information out of brighter areas in your film. Pushing and pulling your film is essentially developing it as a different ISO from the box speed. So standard developing is when we're developing our 400 ISO at 400. Push processing would be if we were developing our 400 ISO as an 800 ISO film. Pull processing is the opposite, where we would be developing our 400 ISO as a 200 or a 100 ISO. It's also important to be thinking about that early on when you buy your film and when you load it into the camera and in the way that you expose it when you're taking your pictures. Because again, film developing and film exposing go hand in hand in order to create your final image. There seems to be a lot of information here, and there kind of is, but also as you learn about this process and what exactly things are doing and what's going on, and also do your own research, then it will become easier for you to be able to do yourself. Don't get frustrated, because hey, I believe in you probably, and I made this video, so you can just go back to the beginning and watch it again. There are some things that are really useful to keep in mind for best results, and these are, again, just some basic things. If you're mixing lots of chemicals, then do it in a well-ventilated area, a room with an open window or a fan. People usually recommend not doing this stuff in a kitchen where there's food and open containers and the possibility of cross-contamination, but also lots of people develop in kitchen sinks anyways, and I'm probably not going to stop people who want to, and I also sometimes do it myself. In general, don't ingest chemicals and be sure to clean up after yourself really thoroughly. These chemicals also aren't particularly light sensitive themselves, so you don't really have to worry about storing them at the bottom of a hole in the ground or mixing them in complete darkness in the first place either. I mean, don't store them on a windowsill, but you don't really have to worry about keeping them in complete darkness all the time. Film chemicals, though, should be stored in containers that don't hold a lot of air because oxygen can reduce the lifespan of this stuff. You can get jugs that are better for storing chemicals, of course, and people like Sinisto make jugs like these that, can compress down and get rid of a lot of the excess air inside the tank, so then they're just holding mostly the chemicals. A lot of people also recommend using glass bottles and like appropriate like stoppers for those as well, but it's not the end of the world if you don't have special containers to store all your chemicals. Also, wearing gloves during this process and you're handling these chemicals is a really good thing to keep in mind, especially for color chemicals, color developing, because there's bleach and stuff involved that is a little more intensive than some of the black and white stuff. Yeah, that's why if you go back to earlier in this video, you can see that I was wearing gloves, and I did not forget about that important safety tip. When you're agitating the tank, don't go crazy. Be gentle with this stuff, especially 35mm that has sprocket holes that the chemical moves through. Too much frequent movement can result in surge marks and problems that show up on your images, and that's a big bummer. For disposing chemicals, it's also really important to look up your own guidelines for like hazardous waste disposal, that kind of stuff, depending on the area and like the city that you live in. Fix should never go down the drain because it has silver in the liquid, because that's what it's removing from the film. So this stuff should be disposed of properly at either a hazardous waste drop-off, school darkrooms, local labs if they'll take it. Developers and stop baths are more likely to be able to be neutralized and can easily go down drains. But again, look up your own local guidelines and understand what you can and cannot do. There's a difference if your drains go into a sewer system or if they go into a septic tank system. So important stuff to keep in mind. Film also dries well when there's some humidity in the air. This can give you flatter film negatives, which make it easier to handle and to scan afterwards. Some film though, naturally curly and just like hard to handle and awkward and everything, but not all films should dry with like a curl on it. It can be impacted by your environment. And also there's so many options for developing stuff out there.
You can get alternative reels for Patterson tanks, and also things like the Mod 54 holder, which is a 4x5 sheet film holder that will fit into larger Patterson tanks.
You can also get heaters that make the process easier, specifically for like keeping color developing chemicals at a consistent temperature. Recently I picked up the Cinestill temperature control system. I've only used it a couple of times, but I do really like it, and especially in my apartment that is really cold in the winter and hot in the summer, it does make things easier sometimes. Not everybody needs all this stuff though. Couple of jugs, the ability to mix precisely, and definitely like film developing tanks are necessary, but you don't need this or like special containers all the time just to get into it. There are film developing kits and things that you can buy that have a number of the things that you need to just kind of get started. And for chemicals, there are so many options out there. Chemicals are available from people like Kodak and Ilford, but also like Fomapan and Cinestill and Adox and Accufine. Enough variety of chemicals exist out there for developing that I'm not covering them all now or probably immediately in the future, because there's ones that are harder to get, ones that are more obscure. People make their own sometimes. You can get things like monobath developers that are a 3-in-1, which is like developing, stop, and fix. Some people really like that. I personally am suspicious about it because it feels like using 3-in-1 shampoo, body wash, and conditioner, which is just weird. And you can also do experimental homemade developers like Caffeinol. And Caffeinol is a developing process that a lot of people like playing around with, and it involves using instant coffee and I think vitamin C powder. It is a weird, wild, and wonderful world when you get into film developing because there are so many things out there. Have I covered every piece of information and detail about developing black and white negative film yourself at home in this one video? No. Was I trying to? No. Did I miss something important? I don't think so. Is somebody gonna call me out on something? Maybe. Developing your own film at home is a huge learning opportunity, and it allows you to really take control of the images that you're shooting with this medium. You gain a lot from developing your own film, and it allows you to learn a lot about this whole thing in a way that is so much deeper than you would ever learn from just dropping your film off at a lab and never actually experiencing that side of shooting film yourself. When I worked in a photo lab, there were days where I would develop like 50 rolls in an afternoon, and it would be loading film into developing tanks in the dark. It would be doing multiple rolls in one tank and for different film types, pushing and pulling and making sure that everything is consistent and it looks good and you're taking a lot of time and care. And I learned an incredible amount about film and shooting and developing during that time. But I am also still constantly learning about this medium and the developing side of things because it is so intricate and there are so many ways of doing it. Most importantly, do your own research. Seek out local community darkrooms if things are open. Look even for online courses that are being done by people who have been doing this stuff for decades, and also read books because there are tons and tons of information and books, data sheets, and just stuff that you can check out and learn more about. Because as much as I like to hope that my videos have helped a variety of people get into and learn about this format and shooting film and photography and Super 8 in some way, your learning should definitely not stop when my videos end. Because YouTube is a great resource to a certain extent, but always look for this information and start doing some of it on your own as well if you really want to get into this stuff. There is a world of knowledge for film photography and this hobby outside of YouTube. So if you have the space and the ability to do so, definitely start developing your own film. Black and white, color, slide, go crazy. It's a lot of fun and you're gonna learn a lot when you do. Oh, I was young when I started recording this video. I am now tired and I want lunch.
Party on, dudes.
Big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video today. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people. It's curated specifically for learning and there are no ads and they're always launching new premium classes so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. And hey, it's less than $10 a month with an annual subscription. There are tons of courses over there related to things like Photoshop and Lightroom and Premiere Pro and After Effects and the programs that I use to make these videos, but also to edit my own film scans and work with that side of things, as well as courses related to things like photography fundamentals and composition. It's a great learning resource if you want to expand on some of the ideas and concepts that I introduce and talk about in my videos. So the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description of this video will get a free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. Thank you for watching and checking this out over all the huge number of other home developing videos that exist on YouTube. I hope that I've covered everything in like a unique enough way to me and this channel, but also in a way that people understand it and it answers a lot of questions that you might be left with looking at other videos and resources sometimes. But comment down below, share your experience with developing, help other people, and of course, you know, along with that fourth bonus rule about film developing,
Party on, dudes.
don't forget the general rule of living and interacting with people, including strangers on the internet.
Be excellent to each other.
You can find some links in the description below for some resources and articles and stuff if you're looking to buy things. I didn't include a ton of stuff because there's so many things out there that you can buy and that, you know, some people might need and other people might not need. So there's also the Patreon for Analog Resurgence to support the channel if you're interested. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.